Earth walked out of the Galactic Council, and everything changed forever. The vote was already over before it began. I knew it the moment I walked into the Grand Hall and saw the seating arrangement. The Velhari delegation had shifted 2 seats closer to the center podium. A small move calculated. It meant they had already spoken to the presiding chair before the session opened. The vote on the Orion Corridor trade pact was not going to happen today, not honestly anyway. My name is Dara Vasquez, and I have been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 6 years. Before me there were 3 others. None of them lasted more than 4 years. Not because they were weak, because this place has a way of grinding people down slowly, the way water wears stone, until they stop expecting anything at all. I sat down at Earth's assigned seat, 3rd row from the back. That told you everything you needed to know about how the Council viewed us. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was built inside a massive orbital ring around a neutral star called Kepler's point. The hall itself could seat representatives from 60 species, and every surface was designed to impress. The ceiling was made of transparent alloy, and the star burned quietly beyond it, gold and enormous. The seats were arranged in a wide circle around a central speaking platform, and each delegation had a carved panel beside their seat showing their species sigil. Earth's panel was plain compared to the others. We had only been given 122 years ago, and nobody had offered to upgrade it. The session opened with the usual formalities. The presiding chair, a Dranathi elder named Savith, called the hall to order. His species were tall, long-limbed, with pale silver skin and eyes like deep water. He had always been polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they do not take seriously. The first item on the agenda was the Orion Corridor Trade Pact. I had spent 4 months writing Earth's position on that pact. My team had worked through nights cross-referencing trade law, resource data, and historical precedent going back 2 centuries of council records. The pact, if passed, would open 3 new shipping lanes through the Orion Corridor, lanes that Earth vessels were currently blocked from using. The economic impact for our colonies would have been significant. Real food, real medicine, real building materials reaching settlements that had been running short for years. I stood when the chair called Earth's position to the floor. I spoke clearly, the way I had practiced. I outlined the data. I presented the case. I did not beg. I never beg. I had barely finished my 3rd point when the laughter started. It came from the Velhari table. There were 4 of them seated there, long and angular, wrapped in deep violet ceremonial robes. The lead Velhari representative was a figure called Prithos. He was old even by their standards, and he wore his age-like armor. He had never once spoken directly to me in 6 years. He spoke about me the way you might describe something you had noticed on the floor. Prithos did not bother to stand. He simply turned to the delegate beside him and said loudly enough for the hall's acoustics to carry it everywhere that he found it remarkable the noise-making species had been allowed floor time again, given that their proposal was essentially a child asking to sit at the adult table. 3 other delegations laughed. Not nervously, not uncomfortably. They laughed the way people do when they are sure the target of the joke cannot do anything about it. I looked at Savith. He did not move. He looked at the table in front of him. I looked at the Dranathi seats. They were Earth's closest ally on the council, or so we had been told. Savith's junior colleague, a younger Dranathi named Rael, was studying his own hands. Nobody said a word in our defense. Not one voice. I stood there at the speaker's platform. For a moment that felt much longer than it was, I thought about the 22 years Earth had been part of this council. I thought about the dues we paid, not small amounts, amounts that strained our budget every cycle. I thought about the peacekeeping personnel we had sent to 4 different conflict zones at the council's request. I thought about the scientists we had loaned to joint research programs, the agricultural specialists we had sent to struggling colonies, the medical teams we had deployed after the Sulkai food blight 3 years ago. I thought about every time in Earth motion had been quietly shelved, every time our requests had been rerouted to committees that never met, every time I had been told in careful diplomatic language that perhaps Earth needed more time to understand how the Council functioned. 22 years. I looked at Prithos. He was already speaking to someone else. Something shifted inside me, not anger. Exactly, anger burns. This was colder than that. This was clarity. I picked up my documents from the platform. I stacked them neatly. I switched off my translation earpiece and slid it into my jacket pocket. Then I looked at Savith and I said in a voice that was completely steady that Earth was done asking for permission. I walked off the platform and toward the exit. The hall went completely silent. I did not look back. I had learned a long time ago that the moment you look back, they think you are uncertain. I was not uncertain. With every step I took across that floor, I felt more certain than I had in 6 years. The doors opened automatically, and I walked through. On the other side, my aide, a young man named Owen Clark, was waiting. He was 26, sharp and very good at hiding how worried he was. He was not hiding it well right now. He looked at me and then at the closed doors behind me and then back at me. I said, "Walk with me," and I kept moving. We were in the shuttle bay within 4 minutes. I did not say anything during those 4 minutes. Owen did not ask. He had worked with me long enough to know when silence was not emptiness but calculation. We boarded the Earth Consulate shuttle, a modest vessel compared to the Velhari cruisers parked in the adjacent bay, and I sat down and pulled out my personal comm unit. 2,400 messages had arrived in the last 6 minutes. The Council's live broadcast system had carried everything. Every species with a communications network had seen it. 48 civilizations had watched Earth's ambassador walk out of the Grand Hall. I scrolled through the first dozen messages without opening them. I said to Owen, "Get me a secure line to Geneva." He was already dialing. The Secretary General picked up in under a minute, which told me she had been watching. I said, "I assume you saw." She said every word. There was a pause, then she said, "You did what the last 4 ambassadors all wanted to do and never had the nerve to try. We are behind you, Dara, completely." I looked out the shuttle window at the great orbital ring and the star beyond it. I said, "Then it is time to move to the second part of the plan." She said, "It is already in motion." I leaned back and looked at those 2,400 messages still filling my screen, and for the first time in 6 years, I let myself breathe. Owen Clark was 26 years old, and he had a habit of tapping his fingers against his knee when he was thinking hard about something. He had been tapping for 11 straight hours by the time we docked with the Earth consulate vessel Resolute, and he finally stopped when he saw what was waiting for us. There were 14 people crowded into the Resolute's main briefing room: legal analysts, trade specialists, 2 economists who had flown up from Geneva, and a quiet woman in the back named Fiona Greer, who worked in a department whose full name I was not allowed to say over open channels, but whose purpose everyone in that room understood. They had been ready for this moment for 8 years. That was the detail most people did not understand when they watched the footage of me walking out of the Grand Hall. They saw a moment of frustration, a diplomat finally losing patience. That was not what it was. What I had done was pull a trigger on a plan that had been built slowly and carefully over almost a decade. I sat down at the head of the table and looked at Fiona. She slid a single document across the table to me, 43 pages, dense, precise, formatted in the official style of Galactic Council administrative law. She said, "It is ready. We have been ready since last Tuesday. We were only waiting for the right moment." The document was Earth's notice of conditional withdrawal. It was not a rage declaration. It was not a dramatic statement of anger. It was a legal instrument constructed by the finest minds Earth had dedicated to the task, and it cited 19 specific violations of the Galactic Council Charter that had been committed against Earth over the course of our membership. Each violation was documented with dates, session records, transmission logs, and witness accounts. Every single one had been reported through proper channels at the time it occurred, and every single one had been ignored or quietly dismissed. The document did not say Earth was leaving forever. It said Earth was withdrawing under Article 7, Clause 14 of the Charter, the clause that allowed a member species to suspend participation pending resolution of documented grievances. It was completely legal. It was completely airtight, and it had been filed with the Council's own administrative system the moment I stepped through those doors. Owen looked up from his copy and said, "They are going to say we are overreacting." I said, "Let them. The document does not react. It states facts." The first response from the Council arrived within the hour. It was from the Velhari delegation, which did not surprise anyone. The message was formal and cold, informing us that our notice had been received and that the Council considered it a disruption to galactic stability, and that Earth was expected to return and fulfill its obligations. Our automated response went out 40 seconds later. It read, "Our terms are attached. Have a productive session." Fiona actually smiled when she saw that go out. But there was a larger question in that room that nobody had said aloud yet. Question underneath all the legal precision, the question the Council itself was clearly just now beginning to confront. Why did it matter if Earth left? For 2 decades, the narrative had been simple. Earth was a young species still developing, still learning the rhythms of galactic society. We were allowed a seat at the table as a kind of goodwill gesture, a demonstration of the Council's inclusivity. Our resources were modest. Our military presence was minimal. We had no ancient alliances, no territorial claims older than a century, by every measure the council used to rank. Significance, we were near the bottom. That was the story they told. Here is the story they had not been paying attention to. 22 years ago, when Earth joined the Council, our engineers had been assigned to a minor infrastructure project, helping to maintain the FTL relay network that connected the outer systems. Nobody important wanted that assignment. It was slow, technical, and unglamorous. Earth took it because we needed something to do, something that would make us useful. Over the following decade, our engineers did not just maintain the relay network. They redesigned significant portions of it, and in doing so, they developed a component, a small crystalline regulator, used in FTL stabilizers that turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to manufacture. It required a very specific combination of environmental conditions and a particular kind of precision that Earth's manufacturing processes happened to be uniquely suited for. 43% of all active FTL stabilizers in the Galactic network used a component built in one of 3 Earth-operated facilities. Nobody on the Council had thought to ask where those components came from. They had always simply arrived. The second thing the Council had not noticed was our mediators. Earth had produced in the last 15 years an unusual number of diplomatic specialists who were very good at sitting in rooms with people who could not stand each other and helping them find a way forward. We had been asked informally to send these specialists to various conflict zones as quiet observers. They were never given official mandates. They never appeared in Council reports. But 14 disputes that the Council's official mediation body had formally failed to resolve had been quietly settled in back rooms and on neutral ships by human mediators who spoke carefully and listened without interrupting. The third thing was the Dranathi lung plague. 4 years ago, a respiratory illness had spread through Dranathi population centers with alarming speed. Council's medical commission had identified the pathogen but had not been able to develop a reliable treatment. Earth's bioresearch team, working in a facility on Titan, had cracked the synthesis for a treatment compound within 7 months. We had shared it freely. We had asked for nothing in return. Savath himself had sent a personal message of gratitude. And then, as far as the Council was concerned, the moment had passed and Earth had gone back to being unimportant. All of this was in the document we had just filed, not as a list of complaints, as evidence of integration, as proof that Earth had become load-bearing in ways the Council had never bothered to examine. The realization was beginning to ripple outward. I could see it in the nature of the messages coming in. The first wave had been shock, then outrage from the Velhari, then a strange silence from everyone else. And now, in the 3rd hour after my walkout, something different was starting to appear in my inbox. Requests for private conversations. Not from the Velhari, from the smaller delegations, from the Sulkai who ran some of the largest agricultural operations in the mid-systems and who had quietly relied on Earth's seed bank technology for 3 seasons. From the Marrow Collective, a 3-planet federation who had an Earth mediator currently sitting in one of their internal negotiations. From species I barely had names for who had never once spoken to us in open session. They were not reaching out to demand we return. They were reaching out because they were scared. Not of us leaving, they were scared. Because they were looking at their own situations clearly, maybe for the first time, and realizing that what had happened to Earth had also been happening to them. I was reading through the fourth such message when Owen put a hand on my shoulder and said, "There is one more." He held out his own comm, and I looked at the screen. The message was from Rael, the young Dranathi diplomat who had studied his hands during Prithos's laughter, the one who had said nothing. The message was 2 sentences. It read, "We need to talk not as council members, as people who owe you an apology." I read it twice. Then I handed the comm back to Owen and said, "Send him coordinates for the way station at Meridian Point. Tell him we will meet in 4 days. Tell him he can bring the Sulkai and the Marrow Collective if they want to come. Tell him this conversation will not be a council session. There will be no official record, no presiding chair, no voting procedures." Owen asked, "What will it be then?" I said, "It will be honest." He went to send the message, and I sat alone at the briefing table for a moment, looking at the 43-page document, at all those years of careful documentation, all that accumulated patience sitting on the table in front of me like a stone that had finally been dropped. It made a sound when it landed. The galaxy was beginning to hear it. The way station at Meridian Point was not impressive to look at. It had been built by a species called the Torathi, who had gone quiet 3 centuries ago and left behind a handful of empty structures throughout the outer systems. The way station was basically a large rock with a pressurized interior, docking clamps on 3 sides, and an atmospheric system that hummed constantly and smelled faintly of mineral dust. It was, however, completely off the Council's official communication grid. That was the only feature that mattered. Owen and I arrived 12 hours early and swept the place ourselves. Old habit from my early diplomatic training. You never meet on someone else's ground without checking it first. And you never assume neutral ground is actually neutral until you have looked at every corner of it. It was clean. The delegations arrived in the following order. First, the Sulkai, who sent 2 representatives, both female, both wearing the layered amber robes of their senior diplomatic class. Then the Marrow Collective, 3 figures, who moved in a coordinated way that never stopped feeling slightly unnatural, but who were among the most precise thinkers I had ever negotiated alongside. Then 2 smaller species whose names I will not attempt here because their spoken form was essentially a series of tones rather than syllables, but who I will call the Aldari and the Keth for the purposes of memory. And last, the Dranathi. Rael walked in with 2 colleagues and stopped when he saw me. He was younger than I expected from his message, young for his species anyway, which put him somewhere around 90 years old in Earth terms. He had the characteristic Dranathi silver skin, but his eyes were darker than Savath's, more gray than deep water, and he looked like someone who had not slept well in 4 days. He said, "Ambassador Vasquez, thank you for agreeing to meet." I said, "Thank you for reaching out." We sat. There was no presiding chair, no speaker's platform, 6 delegations around a battered metal table in a mineral-smelling room inside a dead species abandoned rest stop, And for the first time in any meeting I had attended in 6 years, nobody was performing for anyone. The senior Sol Kai representative, woman whose name translated roughly as Elder Maris, spoke first. She said that her people had watched the footage of my walkout 17 times in the hours after it happened. She said they had watched it not because it was dramatic, but because they recognized it. She said that 40 years ago a Sol Kai ambassador had done something similar, though less publicly, and had been quietly sanctioned until their government replaced her. She said we should have spoken louder. Then we did not. We are speaking now. The Marrow Collective's lead figure said that they currently had an Earth mediator aboard their third colony ship, helping to negotiate a water rights dispute between 3 of their settlements. He said that when news of Earth's withdrawal reached the ship, their mediator had immediately offered to leave if it was no longer appropriate for her to be there. He said their council had unanimously asked her to stay. He said that was when they understood that whatever their relationship was with Earth, it was not something they were willing to let the Galactic Council define for them. I let everyone speak before I said anything. This was not a negotiating tactic. It was genuine. I wanted to hear what they had actually come to say before I responded to any of it. What I heard underneath the different voices and the different concerns was the same sentence spoken in different ways. They were tired of being managed. They were tired of showing up to sessions where the outcome was already decided. They were tired of watching elder species treat the council like a private arrangement while younger species carried the costs and were given the title of members as compensation. When it was my turn, I did not speak carefully in the way that ambassadors usually speak, building every sentence around what I was not saying. I spoke directly. I said that Earth had not walked out in frustration. I said that we had walked out because we had prepared to walk out, because we had spent years building a case that the system was not functioning as it was designed to function, and because we believed that the only way to change something is to demonstrate that you are willing to leave it. I said that we were not here to replace the council with something else. We did not want to run anything. What we wanted was simple, and I would say it plainly: equal voting rights with no hierarchy based on species, age, or territorial size, open access treaties for scientific and medical knowledge so that a cure synthesized by one species could not be held back from another by commercial arrangements, an independent body to handle trade disputes, one not chaired by a species with commercial interests in the outcome, and a formal apology entered into the official record for the documented violations in our withdrawal notice. The room was quiet when I finished. One of the smaller species, the Aldery representative, asked if the apology was genuinely non-negotiable or if it was an opening position. I said it was non-negotiable. Rael, who had been listening without interrupting, leaned forward and said something I did not expect. He said, "Then I will give it now, on behalf of the Drenathi people, not as a council gesture personally." We sat in that hall and said nothing. We had the influence to speak, and we chose our comfort over your dignity. That was wrong. I am sorry. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. The apology cost him something. I could see it. His 2 colleagues were very Still, for the Drenathi who measured status in terms of what they had never publicly admitted, saying those words in front of 6 delegations was not a small thing. I accepted it. Then I set down the framework document. 27 pages, we called it for working purposes the Resolute Accords because we were meeting to draft it on the Resolute, or because that was the name Owen had used once and it had stuck, which was honestly how most things get named. We worked for 9 hours. We did not agree on everything. There were sharp disagreements about the structure of the independent trade body, about whether the scientific access treaty should be reciprocal or unilateral in its first phase, about what counted as a sufficient definition of equal voting rights when some species had 10 times the population of others. But we kept working, and somewhere in the 7th hour, when Elder Maris and the lead Marrow figure were arguing quietly but constructively about treaty language, while one of the Caith representatives sketched structural diagram on the table surface. With a stylus, I looked at Owen across the room and he gave me the smallest nod. This was actually happening. We had the outline of something real. Not a protest, not a walkout in the records, a framework, a beginning. Then Owen's calm vibrated. He looked at it and his face changed in a way that made my stomach drop. He crossed to me and tilted the screen so I could read it. A Velhari warship had just dropped out of FTL transit 40,000 km from the way station. Its identifier was the Dominion of Right, a heavy enforcement vessel, and it was broadcasting on open galactic frequencies that the gathering at Meridian Point constituted an unauthorized political assembly in violation of council administrative codes, and that all parties were instructed to disperse immediately. The room had gone very quiet. Several of the smaller delegates were already moving toward the docking corridor. Old habits, old fear, the way you flint from something that has been above you for a long time. I put my hand flat on the table and said, "Please sit down." They stopped. I picked up my personal comm and opened the channel to Commander Yusuf Adami, aboard the Earth consulate vessel Resolute. Yusuf had been one of the best tactical officers in Earth's fleet before he was assigned to consulate duty, which many of his colleagues considered a demotion. Yusuf did not see it that way. He said if things went as he expected, they would eventually go. Consulate duty was where the interesting decisions got made. I said, "Yusuf, you are aware of our situation." He said, "I have been aware of it for about 40 minutes. I have been waiting for you to call." I said, "What does it look like from your position?" He said, "Like an opportunity if you want my honest opinion." I said, "Show them." He said, "Understood, give me 90 seconds." Yusuf Adami had been in the Earth consulate fleet for 11 years, and in that time he had developed a very specific and deeply held belief about how confrontation works. It is not about force, it is about geometry. Force says, "I am bigger than you." Geometry says, "I have already thought through every move you can make and position myself to make all of them pointless." Force requires energy. Geometry requires intelligence. Yusuf had plenty of both, but he preferred to use the one that did not leave wreckage. The Resolute was a consulate vessel, which meant it was built for range and endurance rather than engagement. It had Good shields, good engines and weapon systems that the Council's registry listed as standard grade, which was accurate as far as it went. What the registry did not list was the fact that 3 months ago, on a quiet docking rotation in the Kepler belt, the Resolute had met briefly with 3 other Earth vessels, the survey ship Steadfast, the resupply carrier Aldgate, and the fleet escort Wren. And in the course of that meeting, Yusuf and the captains of those 3 ships had spent 6 hours discussing a very specific tactical formation that Earth strategic planners had developed 18 months earlier and never yet had reason to use. They had all agreed it was worth knowing. When Dara's call came in, Yusuf was already at his operations console with the formation coordinates mapped. He sent the order. On the Velhari warship Dominion of Right, Captain Verk had been in military service for 40 years and had been involved in 11 enforcement actions, none of which had required him to actually fire. His ship was one of the most advanced vessels in the Velhari fleet, 3 times the mass of a standard council escort with weapons arrays that could reduce a way station like this one to component particles in under a minute. He had expected the usual response to the dispersal order, nervous compliance, some delay, some communication back and forth, and then quiet departure. He was watching his sensors when 4 Earth vessels dropped simultaneously out of FTL transit at precise intervals around his ship. He stared at the configuration on his display for a long moment. The formation was not aggressive. Nobody had powered weapons. Nobody was broadcasting warnings. The 4 ships had simply appeared, each one positioned at a specific distance and angle from his vessel, and the geometry of those positions was immediately and unmistakably clear to anyone with tactical training. If his ship fired in any direction, the geometry of the formation meant the shot would interact with the shielding configurations of the nearest Earth vessel, and the resulting deflection would send energy directly back toward his own hull. The mathematics of it were elegant and unforgiving. He could calculate it himself in under a minute, which meant his tactical officer had calculated it in under 30 seconds and was now looking at him from across the bridge without saying anything. No shots had been fired, no ultimatums had been issued. The Resolute's communication channel opened and a calm male voice said, "Captain Verak, you appear to be within our formation perimeter. We recommend a course adjustment for your safety." Verak looked at his display. He looked at his tactical officer. He looked at the 4 ship icons on his screen, each one sitting exactly where it needed to be to make any aggressive move. Mathematically self-defeating. He said nothing for 31 seconds. Then he ordered course adjustment to departure bearing. The Dominion of Right turned and engaged its engines. No shots fired, no threats exchanged, no dramatic declaration, just a warship quietly choosing the only option that made sense. Back in the way station, the delegations had watched the sensor feed on Owens. Calm in complete silence, the Sulak elder had her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had changed color. The Marrow Collective representatives were utterly still. Rail had leaned forward with his elbows on the table and had not moved. When the Velhari ship turned and its icon moved away on the display, the room let out a collective breath that was not quite a sound but filled the space. Anyway, the Aldari representative looked at me and said something in his tonal language that his translation unit rendered as, "How long have you been capable of this?" I looked at the empty space on the display where the Velhari ship had been. I said, "Long enough to know we did not need to show it until now." The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Rail sat back in his chair and made a short sound that his translation unit rendered as a laugh, but which seemed to mean something more like recognition. The sound of someone who has finally understood something they should have understood much earlier. Elder Mari said, in a voice that was completely steady, that she believed they should return to the document. We returned to the document. 3 hours later, just before dawn. Cycle on the way station's atmospheric clock. 11 representatives from 6 species signed the Resolute Accords. The document was 29 pages in its final form, with 4 annex frameworks and a timeline for implementation. It established the principles we had discussed and created a working group to develop the structures. It was not a finished system, it was a commitment to build one. Owen transmitted the signed document publicly at exactly the same moment we released it to the Council's administrative inbox. No advance notice, no press conference. Just the document live on every open channel in the network. I stood in the doorway of the way station as the other delegations began making their way to their ships. Rail stopped beside me on the way out. He looked like someone who was carrying less weight than he had been carrying 4 days ago, though the lines around his eyes were deep and suggested he still had not slept. He said, "What happens now?" I said, "The Council decides whether to adapt or become a room where a few old species talk to each other." He said, "And Earth?" I said, "Earth does what we have always done. We show up, we do the work, we ask for nothing we have not earned." He looked at me for a moment in the way that people look at someone when they are deciding whether to say something. He said, "For what it is worth, I think you have always earned more than you were given." I said, "I know, that is why we stopped waiting to be given it." He nodded once and walked to his ship. I stood there until all the ships had undocked and the way station was quiet. Again, just the hum of the atmospheric system and the faint smell of mineral dust, and I let myself stand still for a moment in the middle of all of it. Then Owen appeared beside me with 2 cups of very bad synthesized coffee and handed one over without saying anything. We drank in silence. The Accords were out in the world now. Everything that came next would be shaped by what we had done in this cold, mineral-smelling, borrowed room. I thought that was exactly the right place to begin something new. 6 months later, I was standing on a rooftop in Nairobi. It was a real rooftop, earth rooftop. Concrete under my feet, warm air that carried the smell of the city below, a sky that was just moving from orange into deep blue as the sun finished its business for the day. I had forgotten how much I missed the smell of a real sky. You spend enough years on orbital stations and consulate vessels, and you start to think you have adjusted that. The recycled air and artificial light cycles are a reasonable substitute. Then you stand in actual open air, and you understand immediately that you had not adjusted at all. You had just learned to stop noticing what you were missing. The new interstellar diplomatic headquarters occupied the top 12 floors of a building in the center of Nairobi. that had once been a technology campus. It had been converted quickly, too. Quickly in some areas, and certain corridors still smelled vaguely of the previous tenants, but it had good conference facilities, translation suite that could handle 47 languages simultaneously, and a rooftop that nobody had told me I was not allowed to use, which I appreciated. I had been up here for 20 minutes when Owen found me. He was carrying a tablet in his jacket, which meant he had come from a meeting and planned to go directly to another one. His schedule had become extraordinary in the last 6 months. My schedule had become extraordinary. The schedules of most people working in this building had become extraordinary, and the thing that nobody had thought to warn us about when we started all this was that winning creates more work than losing does. He said, "The briefing is in 40 minutes. I said, "I know." He stood beside me and looked out at the city. He said, "There are 17 new messages from the Velhari diplomatic office." I said, "Is any of them an apology?" He said, "No. They are describing the Resolute Accords as a destabilizing instrument and suggesting that Earth has acted outside its appropriate scope." I said, "File them with the others." He made a note. The Velhari had been sending messages like this every week since the Accords were published. They had also quietly stopped blocking 2 of the shipping lane proposals that had been sitting in council committees. They had not announced this. They had not drawn attention to it. They had simply let the votes proceed, and the votes had passed, and the shipping lanes were now open. They were adjusting. They did not want anyone to see them adjusting, but they were. That was actually fine. I was not interested in humiliating anyone. I was interested in results. The results 6 months in were these. 13 species had now formally signed the Resolute Accords or submitted letters of intent to do so. The independent trade arbitration body had been established as a working pilot program handling 6 active disputes, and in 4 of those disputes, preliminary agreements had already been reached. The Open Access Medical Treaty was still in negotiation, which was frustrating, but the framework was solid, and 3 species had already begun sharing research data ahead of the formal ratification, which was the kind of thing that happened when the principle was right, even if the paperwork was slow. The FTL component facilities had continued operating without interruption. Throughout all of this, nobody had asked them to stop. Nobody had threatened to shut them down. They had just kept running because the people who worked in them had jobs to do and did them, which was how most of the important things in the world continued to function, regardless of what was happening in meeting rooms. The Galactic Council still met. The Velhari still sat in their designated seats. The hall still functioned on a schedule and with proper procedural form, but the room had changed, not physically in weight, the assumption that certain species set the terms and others learn to work within them had cracked, not all the way through, but enough that the light was getting in. Rail had been elevated to Dranath senior ambassador status 2 months after Meridian Point. He and I had a standing communication session every Thursday. He was good at his work, genuinely good, and he was working hard to move his own government toward a formal accords ratification. Savith had retired from public service 6 weeks ago. His retirement notice had been brief and had said nothing about the events of the last 6 months, which probably meant it said everything. The press briefing I was about to attend was the 14th I had done since returning to Earth. The first 13 had been intense, full of urgent questions about whether we had started a war, whether Earth was in danger, whether the galaxy was going to come apart. By the 8th briefing, the questions had shifted. Now they were about implementation and timelines, about which species were next in line to join the accords, about what the independent arbitration bodies ruling in the Sulkai water trade case would mean for similar disputes. People were starting to think about what came next rather than what had gone wrong. That was, I thought, the clearest possible sign that something had actually changed. I heard the door open behind me and turned to see a young woman step onto the rooftop. She was one of the junior press correspondents here early for the briefing, and she looked slightly alarmed to have found me here. She apologized and started to back away, and I said there was no need to apologize. The rooftop was not mine. She stopped. She said, "Actually, can I ask you something off the record?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When you walked out of that hall, were you scared?" I thought about it, the honest answer. I said, "Yes, I was terrified." She looked slightly surprised, as if she had expected something more composed. I said, "I kept walking anyway because I kept thinking about what Earth has survived: ice ages, every kind of illness you can imagine, centuries of the worst that people can do to each other. We came out of all of that still arguing, still building, still trying to improve. I thought if we survived all of that, a council chamber full of aliens who do not respect us is not going to be what breaks us." She nodded. She said, "And were you always planning to walk out? Was it all calculated?" I said, "The preparation was calculated. The moment was real." She wrote something in her notes. Then she said thank you and went back inside. Owen checked his watch and said, 30 minutes. I said, "I know." We stayed on the rooftop a little longer. The city moved below us. The sky went deeper blue, and the first few lights were beginning to appear in the buildings across the way, small, bright rectangles where people were finishing their days and beginning their evenings, cooking and reading and talking to each other, doing the ordinary business of being alive on this planet. I thought about something that had arrived 2 days ago, a package from Rail. Inside was a small object the size of my fist, gray-green, smooth, with a faint warmth to it that did not seem to come from temperature, a Dranath memory stone. I had read about them but never seen one. There was a note with it in Rail's handwriting that said only, "Press it gently and hold still." I had done this alone in my office with the door closed because I did not know what to expect. What I felt was not sound exactly. It was closer to understanding, a fragment of experience that settled into me like something I had always known but not yet articulated, and through it came Rail's voice, calm and clear, saying, "This," he said, "I have lived for 400 years. I have served in diplomatic posts for 300. Of them I have watched your species. From the day Earth joined the Council, I watched you try and be turned away. I watched you bring solutions that were used without credit. I watched you absorb insults that I, in my own comfortable position, told myself were not my responsibility to address. I was wrong about that, and I knew I was wrong, and I did nothing anyway. I am telling you this not because I want your forgiveness, although I hope for it. I am telling you because I think you should know that someone who had been watching for a long time finally saw you. Clearly, I'm ashamed it took so long. But I see you now. The memory stone had gone quiet after that, and I had sat in my office for a while with it in my hands, not thinking about policy or timelines or the next step in anything. Just sitting with the fact that 400 years of life had looked at 22 years of hours and found something worth respecting. That was not nothing. On the rooftop in Nairobi with Owen beside me and the city spreading out below, I looked up at the sky that was not just a sky anymore. It was a map. Every visible star had a name now, in more languages than any human mind could hold, out there across distances that numbers failed to fully express. 13 civilizations had signed a piece of paper built in a cold way, stationed by people who were willing to sit in a room together and speak honestly. It was not the end of anything. It was, if we were careful and continued to show up and do the work and not mistake one good moment for a finished story. It was a beginning. I thought of the question that had been asked most often in the 14 press briefings. People wanted to know what we had proven. They wanted the lesson stated clearly, the way lessons are supposed to be stated. I had a different answer for every briefing because I was still thinking it through. But the closest I had come, the version that felt truest when I said it, was this: we did not walk out because we gave up. We walked out because we had finally and completely decided that we deserved better than what we were being offered. And the surprising thing, the thing nobody fully anticipates until they do it, is that when you decide you deserve better and you act on that decision with preparation and clarity and patience, the world has a way of reorganizing itself around that decision. Not immediately, not without resistance, not without moments where you are standing in a mineral-smelling room, watching a warship turn its nose toward you on a sensor display, and you are counting seconds in your head and reminding yourself that you did the math and the math is right. But eventually, the galaxy had not been waiting for us to be perfect. We are not a perfect species. We are loud and contradictory, and we argue constantly, and we make the same mistakes in new configurations with impressive regularity. But we are also stubborn in the specific way that is useful, the kind of stubborn that does not give up on the idea that things should be fair, that the table should have room for everyone, that an apology spoken in front of witnesses means we had decided we deserved better. It turned out the galaxy had been waiting for someone to figure that out. Owen said 20 minutes. I said, I know, let's go. We went back inside, down through the building, into the briefing room where the lights were bright and the questions were waiting. I stood at the podium and looked out at the rows of reporters, human and otherwise, because 3 alien press correspondents had credentials now and sat in the 3rd and 4th rows with translation units in their ears, and I thought that was exactly the kind of ordinary miracle that happened when you stop settling for less than ordinary miracles. The first question was about the arbitration body's timeline. I answered it clearly and completely. Then the next one and the next. The work continued, the way work always does, not in dramatic moments, but in The accumulation of careful, honest, persistent effort. The kind of effort that looks unremarkable from the outside and that changes everything from the inside. We had walked out, and then we had walked back in on our terms into a room that was already different because we had left it. That I had come to believe was how things actually change. Not with a perfect plan or a perfect moment, but with the decision made clearly and without apology that you are done accepting what you have been given and ready to build what you actually need. Earth had made that decision. The rest we were still writing.